Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's stream. This is not a live stream, but rather a stream. I have recorded it a few hours ago before the usual time of the live streams on Syriana Analysis. The reason for that is that I have to go into an emergency meeting and I cannot, unfortunately, be present on the live stream time 17 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. So I will record this and post it for you, and it is not going to be as long as the previous live streamings. However, it's going to be very educational, especially that I'm going to link between historical events and the current ongoing events. And I'm sure many of you tune into Syriana Analysis for educational purposes and for those who want to get historical perspective and geopolitical context about the current events in the Middle East, and especially in Syria, where I come from. Now, my opinion about the Arab Spring is a little bit different than the opinion of the mainstream pundits. Many people consider it an Arab Spring. I don't see there has been spring, at least after 13, 14 years for the start of this Arab Spring. At least at the beginning, maybe the opinions were varied. Some people were very enthusiastic. I myself was enthusiastic at the beginning, at the first 3 months, especially after the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. We thought, of course, naively, that this is going to lead into prosperous democratic regimes in the region. But now, after 14 years, at least with the current conditions and circumstances, we can see that the Arab Spring didn't really bring much of evolution, because the revolutions were supposed to bring some evolution to these countries, but rather we have taken a few steps back. And this is nothing new in the region. And I'm not here to judge, of course, the people or the leaders or anyone, but I'm going to try to give you an historical example to draw parallels between what happened probably 100 years ago or more, 110 years ago, with the Arab Spring. And as you may know, guys, the Arabs were ruled for 400 years by the Ottoman Empire. And many of them were not satisfied, and they wanted to set free from the Ottoman Empire, and they don't want to live under the Turkish occupation. And during this time when at the beginning of World War I or before the start of the World War I, the imperialists, and in this case Great Britain, they had a brilliant idea, of course in favor of the British interests in this regard, in order to convince the Arabs to rise against the Ottoman Empire. You should wage a revolution against the Ottoman Empire, said the Brits, we will support you. And when you kick out the Turkish occupation or the Ottoman Empire, then you will enjoy a united Arab nation. This was the promise for the Arabs back then. I think when we draw parallels with the Arab Spring, all these British, American, let's say the same imperialist powers who convinced the people that they have to rise against their dictatorships. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't rise against dictatorship, and I'm not against democratic rules. However, I would also argue that when you embed yourself with the imperialists, then you cannot really expect them to pursue your own interests, but rather their own interests. So what happened 110 years ago in the region? This is an important thing. So during World War I, the British Empire was keen on undermining the Ottoman Empire, which controlled much of the Middle East, of course, and was allied back then with Germany. So to achieve this, the Brits seek to incite an Arab revolution against the Ottomans. And back then we had Sharif Hussein. Sharif Hussein was the leader of the Hashemite clan and the emir of Mecca, who was a key figure in this strategy. Hussein aspired to establish an independent Arab state encompassing the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. Between 1915 and 1916, a series of letters or exchange between Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein. Now, in these letters, McMahon, on behalf of the British government, appeared to promise Hussein that if he led an Arab revolt against the Ottomans, Britain would support the establishment of an independent Arab state after World War I. The most contentious part of these letters, of course, revolved around the boundaries of this proposed Arab state. Now, Hussein, on one hand, believed that the British had agreed to include Palestine within the Arab states. However, the language used in the correspondence in these letters were deliberately vague. McMahon excluded certain areas from the promised Arab state, citing French interests and other considerations, but the exact boundaries were left ambiguous. Encouraged by these promises, Hussein and his sons, including Faisal and Abdullah, led the Arab Revolution against the Ottomans from 1916 to 1918. The revolt was successful in destabilizing Ottoman control in the region, and Arab forces with British support captured key cities like Damascus. While the McMahon-Hussein correspondence was ongoing, the British were also negotiating other agreements that contradicted their promises to Hussein. The most notable of these was the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, and we're going to come now later in this conversation with you. In 2024, 2025, we will see what happened to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was imposed on the Arabs in 1916, it was a secret treaty between Britain and France that divided the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Arab territories into spheres of influence with no regard at all for Arab independence. Additionally, the Balfour Declaration came in 1917, just 1 year after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which promised British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which of course further complicated the situation in the region. Now, after the war, after World War I, the promises made to Hussein was not honored. Instead of an Arab independent state, the League of Nations back then granted Britain and France mandates over the former Ottoman territories. The British mandate for Palestine and the mandate for Syria and Lebanon were established, effectively dividing the region between European powers. Hussein and his sons felt betrayed, but what can they do? Faisal briefly ruled Syria, but was ousted by the French in 1920. The British later installed Faisal as the king of Iraq and Abdullah as the emir of Transjordan, later Jordan, but these were far from the united Arab state Hussein envisioned. So, this failure to fulfill the promises made to Hussein had long-lasting consequences till today in 2025. It sowed, of course, deep mistrust between the Arabic people and Western powers. This contributed to ongoing conflicts in the region. Now, the establishment of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent Arab-Israeli conflicts can be traced back, in part, of course, or in whole, I would argue, to these broken promises and the competing claims over Palestine. So, if we want to summarize this very important historical event, while McMahon's letters to Hussein appeared to promise Arab independence, the British government's simultaneous negotiations with other parties and their post-war actions revealed an imperialist agenda for the region. So this duplicity left a legacy of resentment and instability in the Middle East that persists until today. So we have learned about this very important historical event in our history classes in secondary school and also in the university. So every Syrian who went to school, most Syrians went to school, over 90% before the regime change started, they have learned about this historical event. But have they really learned the lesson? That's the real question. Like, you can learn a text, you can read it, you can memorize it, but did you really learn the lesson? That's the real question, because 100 years later, or 110 years later, with the Arab Spring, the Arabs were, at least this time, the people were promised to enjoy a prosperous democratic regimes or states, or to establish at least a democratic state that would eventually bring them prosperity and development and evolution. And that's why the people revolted against their former regimes in order to enjoy evolution. So many people, of course, joined the ranks because they had good intentions. They wanted for their countries to be developed and evolved. However, I would also argue that during this time, when you see that these same imperialist powers have been strongly supporting these revolutionary quote unquote movements, you would ask questions about the intentions of the imperialist powers. And if the people who revolted against their former regimes are dependent on funding or logistic support or even military support from the imperialist powers, I don't think under such circumstances this could bring evolution to the people, but just a repetition of the Hussein McMahon correspondence, which led to the division and the partition of the Arab land. All these lands that you can see nowadays in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, they were all under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and there were no borders among them. But when the Arabs were promised to gain and get a united Arab nation under one leadership by the Brits in exchange for revolting against the Ottoman Empire, they have done that 110 years ago, but they have gained nothing from it because the Brits have occupied certain regions and then the French occupied certain regions, and those powers were the imperialist powers before the US emerged as the successor of this imperialist power or the empire itself, right? So nowadays I can see that many people, of course, who joined these ranks or took a few steps back because they saw what happened in Egypt, Libya, and then in Syria, but some people didn't. And in this case, I am very suspicious that what happened in Syria, especially after the regime change in Damascus, I'm more leaning towards the theory or the possibility, let's say, that this will lead into another Sykes-Picot. The Sykes-Picot in 110 years ago has divided the region, and they have drawn borders between these countries. And however, at least some of these nations, after a few decades, let's say in Iraq and Syria mostly, they have managed to motivate the people to unite them on a certain level through pan-Arabism. And therefore, pan-Arabism has been the number one enemy of the empire in the past 50 years, I would argue, especially in the 60s and the 70s and onwards. And that's why the empire has supported many of the Islamist groups, because the Islamists or the Takfiri groups are natural enemies and foes for the pan-Arabists. Pan-Arabists want to establish a united Arab countries based on pan-Arabism and the Arabic identity. Meanwhile, the Islamists want to unite the Ummah based on religion and Islam. And therefore, with Syria being couped and regime change is successful in Syria, I think the Arab unity or pan-Arabism is dead. And now it's the time for the Islamists to rule Syria. But the Islamists are basically a natural threat. And I'm not talking about just an Islamist. I'm talking about the Takfiri groups like HDS, Nusra, ISIS, etc. The mentality, right? They're natural. They will pose naturally a threat against the religious and ethnic minorities, and this will naturally lead into another partition. So, as if the partition of 110 years ago was not enough, divide and conquer by the imperialist powers, now let's say, in the best case scenario, the imperialist powers have invested and capitalized on the Arab Spring, which I believe it's an Arab autumn and an Arab winter, in order to divide what has been already divided in the past. So dividing the already divided. So in this case, I'm receiving lots of reports from Syria. I'm reading articles. I'm watching videos. It is quite clear that this so-called HDS and Nusra, they cannot rule Syria and convince the people that they represent everyone. When you see Jolani inviting the Christians to the so-called National Dialogue Conference and not allowing them to wear their crosses, when you see Jolani's gangs are terrorizing and killing and kidnapping religious minorities in Latakia, especially the Alawites, when you see the threats of these Jolani gangs against the Kurds, you will notice that the people who are receiving these threats, they start thinking narrow under such circumstances. So instead of thinking as a Syrian, they start thinking as a Druze, as an Alawite, as a Christian. And this is the psychological, let's say, partition of Syria. Before you partition Syria geographically, you partition Syria psychologically. And I think the conditions in Syria are ready for partition. And I'm saying this with a heavy heart. I'm not saying this as someone who is happy of what is happening in Syria at all, because my vision for the region is based on economic integration between the regional countries, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon. And this will definitely lead into a certain level of federalism among these countries. And this is how the Arabs can become independent and powerful and relevant in the region and abroad. But when you divide them, furthermore, after the Sykes-Picot, which already divided the countries, you're just dividing what is divided, and it is a divide and conquer. And therefore, I see that you will notice more ethnic and religious minorities rising against Jolani, probably carrying arms against Jolani, and this will pave the way for partition of Syria. The Alawites, the Druze, the Christians, the Yazidis, the Kurds, the Druze, many different religious and ethnic minorities will join against Jolani, and this will only lead into Jolani keeping the territories in Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Idlib, and probably Damascus. We don't know. Maybe Israel occupies it in the next few months if things stay the way it is. But Jolani will stay in certain geographies, and then the rest will try to govern themselves. So this is a very dark scenario, and this has been proven that it was one of the consequences of the Arab Spring. And therefore, I ask myself always this question: have we learned the lesson? Would the people of the region learn the lesson? Like, if 50 years from now, there was a different project to unite the people, let's say on economic lines or ideological lines or political lines, I don't know, will the people be fooled again by the imperialists? If you ask my honest opinion, I think yes. They will be fooled again over and over again. And they will think that by destroying their own country or revolting against their regimes, they will receive help from the imperialist powers. But I really hope that there would be an educational system in Syria which would teach the people not only the texts, but let them understand the texts, these historical texts, instead of repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Now, in this case, I want to show you a video. This video is a short clip, 1.5 minutes, by Adonis. Who is Adonis? Adonis is a very famous Syrian poet. He is secular, very much, and he has been criticizing political Islam and, let's say, these Islamist Takfiri groups for a long time, and he has been calling for secular regimes and the separation of religion from the society for the sake of evolution and advancement, both on a social level and also on the civilizational level in Syria and abroad. And he has been demonized for a long time by the Islamists, of course, that's a normal thing. And his teachings or preachings have been rejected by many people, but he has proven to be correct. This interview he gave to BBC in 2014, I believe, or 2015, at the peak of ISIS. So he was speaking about the phenomenon of ISIS and phenomenon of al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and how they're destroying our countries. And his basic argument is we are not living in a revolutionary era, but rather we are going it's like a backwardization and not evolution. And he believes that this phenomenon of violence, he compares it to a lake, which is draining, basically. And the draining lake, when you have fishes in this draining lake, they start eating each other. And he says the Arab world is in a demise and not in an era of demise and not in an era of evolution. I'm very much, I was looking for this video for quite some time. I found it today for you, and I'm going to show you this. You have to follow the subtitles in this case, okay? Let's go.
العنف ظاهرة وحشية غير إنسانية، وفي الإطار الوحشي لا تعرف إلى أي مدى يمكن التوحش أن يقودنا. لا أعرف، لكن أمامنا مهاوي كثيرة. وأنا قلت من زمان قديم وأكرر الآن أنه العرب نحن اليوم في مرحلة انقراض، ولسنا لا في مرحلة ثورة ولا في مرحلة نهوض. نحن بحيرة تجف مليئة بالسمك، وهذا السمك يأكل بعضه بعضا بعماوة وبضلال كامل. هذا يقتلك باسم القومية، وهذا يقتلك باسم الدين، وهذا يقتلك باسم القبيلة إلى آخره. وليس هناك أي أفق أمام العرب على الإطلاق، إلا إذا بمعجزة مش عارف خرجوا من هذا السياق التاريخي إلى سياق آخر. والسياق الآخر هو القطيعة الكاملة مع الماضي، مع 14 قرن، وتأسيس مجتمع جديد على أساس قانوني، على أساس القانون، على أساس تحرير المرأة، على أساس خلق نشوء الفرد الحر المستقل، لا على أساس القبيلة ولا الدين ولا الطائفة ولا العشيرة.
So this is what Adonis believes. I'm very curious and interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think this is a radical opinion, or it is a rational opinion after what we have seen in the past 10 years in the region? Please write your opinion, and let's encourage a civilized discussion and conversation. But if I want to just summarize and conclude what happened after the McMahon and Hussein correspondence and copying and repeating the same mistake after 110 years or 100 years after the so-called Arab Spring, I would just like to end this conversation with you by Karl Marx's quote, who said, "History repeats itself first as tragedy, second as farce." I've been your host, guys, Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis. Today's stream was recorded. It wasn't live and it was short. However, I am obliged to go into a very important and urgent meeting. And I will see you on Monday, on this 3rd of February at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you, upon your families.